The winter season is well and truly here, and it's time for us to brighten up those short and dark days by adding a little bit of festive cheer. And what better way to welcome friends and family to your home during this period than by adding a beautiful handmade Christmas wreath to your front door? Without a shadow of a doubt, my favourite wreaths are wild, rustic, and have that lovely foraged and gathered look.
I love nothing more than adding all of those free natural treasures that nature can provide us. And it turns out with a winter walk and a little bit of creativity, you can make your own beautiful wreath that doesn't cost a fortune and is completely biodegradable. When you make your own wreath, it tells a story that no shop-bought decoration ever could. And today I'm going to show you one of the ways that I make my wreaths this wreathing season.
The most magical part of this process is the gathering of all of the materials that we're going to be putting into our wreath. I very much like to be inspired by nature with this process and cut whatever catches my eye. You're not just collecting branches, you're collecting different scents, colours, textures that will come together to create something truly personal and unique. So grab a coat, it's that time of year, get your boots on, and let's go and gather some incredible foliages and materials for creating our Christmas wreaths. The first thing you must keep in mind are foraging ethics. It's pretty simple. Be respectful. If you're on public land, make sure that you stick to paths and where possible, pick up any fallen branches and leaves that may already have fallen from the tree onto the ground. If you're going to cut materials, don't cut more than you need. Make sure you leave plenty of berries behind for the birds. And very importantly, make sure you're using nice, sharp, clean secateurs so that you don't damage the part of the tree that you're leaving behind. According to the law, it is permissible to forage for materials for private use. However, if you are perhaps a grower like me and you are intending to be gathering materials for commercial purposes, so for example, I will be selling lots of the wreaths that I'm making this year, it's better, I feel, to get permission from a private landowner and to gather materials from private land where you're allowed to be. And of course, also make sure you take care of yourself when you're out there foraging. Don't go falling over any barbed wire fences or anything like that. And only cut things that you know are not poisonous. And if things are particularly thorny, make sure you've got a good pair of gardening gloves with you.
If you're making just one wreath, perhaps for yourself, it's a really lovely experience to go out into countryside, into nature, and do a bit of foraging. But don't overlook those things that might also be in your own garden. And perhaps if you're growing cut flowers, you are growing things specifically for cutting and putting in your wreaths. I know for me, something that I grow just for wreathing is this lovely honesty.
Look at the amazing colour of this willow. Of course, there are loads of beautiful different varieties of cornus as well, which will give you an even brighter red. But we definitely need to cut some of these. So before we can start doing the lovely and creative aspect of our wreath, we do need to start with the base. And there are lots of completely biodegradable options that you can use instead of using a wire or a foam. When I first started making wreaths, I actually used to use laurel, but you can really use any bendy stems, maybe something like a cornice. But I grow willow specifically to use to turn into wreath bases, so that's what I'm going to be using today. It doesn't matter what colour your willow is. I've got some orange willow here, but I've quite happily used green willow that grows in hedgerows as well. So if you're out foraging, a nice green willow, here we are, one like this is perfectly fine. If it's still holding on to its leaves, you can remove those. And you can see it's just really, really flexible. So I'm just going to start by making the first loop. Now don't go too big. It's amazing how big you can make a wreath with quite a small base. I think a lot of people say sort of the best size is about 10 inches. I'm afraid I do much of what I do by eye. So that's your first loop. And you want to go in with your second bit of willow from the same side. So I'm going to come in underneath, but just a little bit further down, about 3 or 4 inches further down, and then again just manipulate your willow. You can, of course, if you can't get a complete circle, tie bits together. And who said a wreath has to be round? If you want to tie 4 corners and have a square wreath, then feel free to do, whatever you prefer. The whole purpose of this is you're making something for yourself. If you are looking to make, multiple wreaths, as I will be doing, running out of time already today, but I have to get a light out of here, I think, then I find willow is easier to work with, quickly, because it is one of the most flexible materials, and I'm not having to fiddle around, tying bits. So that's why I like to work with willow. And I'm working with fresh willow this year, but I have in the past purchased Somerset grown willow, but you do need to soak that. Whereas this, if you cut it fresh, is really nice and pliable. Now, depending on whether or not you're going to cover your willow with moss or straw or hay, probably depends on how many willow whips you need to use. If you're going to just be putting your wreath base directly onto the willow, which I've done many times, then you probably want to keep adding to make quite a nice thick base. But if you're going to cover your base with moss that perhaps you've raked from your paddock, or maybe some straw or some hay, it probably doesn't need to be quite so thick, because of course the addition of those materials will give it that extra bit of body, if you like. Now I've added that bit of green willow in just to prove that it's just as bendy as the orange. And if you're foraging, the green will be easier to find. Willows loves growing in damp and wet areas. So if you're out looking for willow, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for somewhere a bit boggy and a bit damp. Okay, so once you've got your sort of as round as you can get its structure, we want to just go ahead and snip off all of these ends. So just sort of at an angle. Again, I'm going to be covering this base. I don't always, but I am today, so it really doesn't matter what it looks like. But if you weren't covering it, this would be the back where you've cut the willow. That would be the back of your wreath, and that would be the front. Because you may choose to do a design where you keep some of the willow exposed, particularly if it is this beautiful orange colour. But I'm going to be covering this whole base, so sadly we're not going to see any of that. So I've got some straw to add next. I do have moss in my paddock, but I've also got straw in the bar, so it's just a flip of the coin as to which one I choose. Right, so in order for this wreath to be biodegradable, obviously I'm avoiding wire. Okay, and then as tightly as you can, you want to just bind your straw. Now don't worry if this looks untidy to begin with, because we will give our straw a bit of a haircut with the scissors at the end. And of course you won't be able to see this. This is just the mechanics of our wreath. This will all be hidden round the back by your door. I've made many wreaths without the addition of straw or hay or moss, but I do think it's easier to use a bit less foliage and to have a slightly fuller looking wreath if you do use it. You tend to need more materials. Not only that, I feel it helps to anchor the materials more tightly. I've done lots of workshops in the past where I have just used the wreath bases, and the beginners do find it harder. So I think if you haven't made a wreath before, you probably may find it easier to just add, as I say, I mean, you could add screwed up bracken if you haven't got hay or straw or moss. But if you really haven't, it doesn't matter. It just means you may use more green materials. Now, I'm just going to manipulate my wreath to make sure that it looks round. And I'm just going to sort out my ball of twine. It's really important that as you're binding tightly, so you do need your ball of twine nicely bound together. And I'm just going to keep going around this straw until I get back to where I started. I did leave a long piece of string to tie the end to. Now, if you're not concerned about whether or not your wreath is biodegradable, of course you can use florist's wire, which probably is slightly easier to work with than the twine. But then, of course, it's not 100% compostable. Although some of the wires, if they're not coated, will rust away to nothing themselves. Right, so I'm just looking for my tail end. There it is, just so I can tie these bits together. So we'll just cut that. So this is where we started. Being brave to pull tight enough without it snapping. And I'm just going to go around again. Just a bit of extra luck. Okay. Okay, so that's our sort of start of the base. And then I don't, want to be able to see any of the straw poking out. So we'll just give it a wee bit of a haircut. I didn't just cut the string then, did I? No, be careful not to cut the string, so don't get carried away. It doesn't have to be really neat. I'm really just trying to get these really long bits off. And you don't need to go out and buy a massive bale of straw. Lots of the pet shops sell really nice, like small bunches. And if you've got a group of friends together, you could share one. Right, there we are. So that's the beginnings of the base. Now our foliage has all had a really good soak in its buckets. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut the foliage into more usable lengths. Piece of one of my dad's Christmas trees. And in the past, if I've been making a lot of Christmas wreaths, I have of course purchased foliage, but also I've been known to buy a very tired, old looking Christmas tree, usually a really wonky one that you can see nobody wants, and then to actually just chop it into pieces. But when I'm doing this, for me, it's important that the tree is British. Now, if you cut your branches at a slant, you don't waste so much of the materials, although you can actually still use those. And that's one of my takeaways if you're somebody who's thinking about doing wreath workshops, is actually to do this before the workshop, especially if you've purchased the foliage, because you will find that the people visiting and making a wreath with you, they're not so worried about wastage as you are, because of course they're not paying for the materials as you may have. So what I want to do now is sort of make up miniature bouquets, and you're going to be looking, depending on how big you make them, a sort of round about 10 bouquets, but obviously you can make additional ones up. And you can, if you want a really formal, symmetrical look, you can make every single bunch exactly the same. Whereas for me, for that wild rustic look, I'm looking to make them all slightly different, but still utilising the colour palette that I've chosen. Now, I certainly will be adding some of my dried elements as I go along, but of course, the great thing about having added the straw is that we can add extra little bits of finishing touches with things like this at the end as well. Now, you can tie your little bouquets, but I tend not to feel that that's necessary. All I'm going to do is really make sort of 10 piles of the different things that I'd like to add to the wreath. So because the thing that I have the most of here is the leyland lie, I'm not sure that's how you say it, but I'm going to make sure that this is what I really bulk my wreath out with. So I will be adding this into every one of my sections. And it's a really lovely texture, but also it smells really lovely too. And then under here somewhere we've got my dad's Christmas tree. And you just see how these different leaf textures really work. And we'll just snip. Where things are a little bit long, you can cut them down. And then obviously we need some colour there. And I feel like a bit of sort of golden rusty colour in there along with the skimmier. And how about, actually I think we'll alternate the skimmier and the ivy because they're sort of quite similar in the fact that they've got that sort of bobbly look. So we've already used skimmier, so we'll save ivy for the next one. So how about a bit of box? Something fat and fluffy at the bottom, because of course that'll be the bit nearest our wreath. Oh, and you know what I'd like to add now as well? Just look at this grass for a bit of fireworks. I'm just going to take off the really brown bits there, but just look at that. And then I feel like some poppies. There we are. So that could be our first bunch. And I'm just I'll cut it to length. As I say, I'm not going to tie my bunches. I'm just going to make them and then set them aside. So again, I want to use plenty of this because I've got plenty. And I can always go back to the obliging tree and get some more. The owners of the tree did actually tell me that they do all need cutting back. Now, if you want to add a bit of sort of bluey colour, you can of course use eucalyptus, but if you turn over some of your evergreens, you will find that they've got a really bluey tone underneath. So that's what we're going to do here. And instead of the skimmia this time, we're going to use the ivy. And I feel like the addition of a bit of our pittosporum now, and that's Elizabeth, this variety. And I've got lots of new baby pittosporums to plant, and I think some rose hips or some holly here. Let's go with a really good rose hip. And what I'm looking to do is just see if my bunches are similar size. So you can see this one's a bit smaller, so let's bulk it out a bit more, and we'll bulk it out at the back, and maybe a bit of Christmas tree. And do you know what? Some twiggy bits, some nice catkins, and maybe one at the front, maybe some alder. Okay, so there we are. We see those are similar size now. Okay, look at that. I really want that at a front. I don't want to put that at the back. Yeah, I really want to get that in the front. And how about some teasel, some nigella? Maybe a few more pods. I've lost my skimmia. There we are. And how about a nice bit of willow in here as well? Maybe a couple of bits. There we are. Okay, make room for that one. We need some holly now, I think. Maybe Christmas tree. A couple of bits of Christmas tree and a really good bit of holly. And maybe a bit of box at the back. And a little bit of pittosporum. Maybe some alder. And then, oh, definitely some honesty now. I've left my honesty in the shed, and that's never a good idea, because by leaving it in the shed, it's gone damp and it's not so easy to peel. It's much easier if you keep it somewhere really dry to peel it. So, yeah, it's just a nice bit of honesty in there as well. And I won't add this right now, but I've also got this silver sand, which we can add a few bits in at the end. It's definitely easier to add that in at the end. And then maybe a bit of ivy. Holly and ivy, got to go together, haven't they? Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and tie our twine back onto our base. And then take one of your little miniature bunches, and you can lay it so that it goes with the circle, but I tend to actually lay mine pointing ever so slightly away. Oh dear, some of this foliage is very spiky. Gloves are great, but I find for binding the twine, unless you've got some fingerless mittens, I find it actually much easier to not wear gloves. So I'm going around several times and then I'm going to choose another bunch. And I fancy myself this one over here, if I can get hold of it. And again, you now just want to lay this one over the top of that one ever so slightly, but trying obviously not to hide all its beauty. You can manipulate your bunch just like that. You know, because I haven't tied them, you can spread them out a little bit. We may even remove some of these leaves because they're just hiding the pretty flowers there of the skimmia. So yeah, if we move a few of those just so that we can see them. Okay, and then without cutting your twine, we're going to go in a continuous loop. We're now going to loop around our second bunch again several times. Okay, and then I feel like, and just whichever bunch you're drawn to really. And I was drawn to this one with this bit of teasel, but I really feel like I want a lot more seed heads and things going on back here. So I'm just going to go ahead and don't be afraid to add as you go along. Just going to add a few more poppy seeds into here. And maybe even another bit of willow. Okay. And then again, laying it over the workings, the string of the bit you've just tied, but trying not to cover up, you know, the pretty flowers. Try and keep those exposed. And then again, just a continuous binding around. And remember, we can add lots to this in a minute, so this isn't the finished product. So try not to worry too much about what it looks like right now. And then I feel like we need, I'm just going to move that bunch out of the way because I really want a bunch with some holly now. And I can see this bunch here that I want to get in. It's amazing how much room you need, isn't it, for something like this? If we just turn our wreath slightly. And I'm right-handed, and I do tend to actually put my bunch on with my right hand, and I tend to bind with my left. But really, it's whatever feels most natural and comfortable to you. Quite often when I'm doing my wreath workshops, people just find the whole thing quite awkward, but once you get into a rhythm. Okay, so then pop that one down a minute. And what I want to do is I want to lift this first bunch so that I can really get this bunch in underneath. And then this is by far the hardest thing you have to do now, is because you want to bind in the bunch you've just put down without tying the, you know, the pretty foliage of your first and original bunch. So I try, oh, dropped a bit of my foliage. I just try and leave a very obvious gap to bind. So this is where we're going to bind. I'm just going to use my arm there to bind. Sorry, to hold while I bind. Sometimes you do need to add one last much smaller bunch, but until we've wrapped this one on and taken a look, we can't really tell. So I think yes, but it can be a lot smaller now, and it doesn't have to have too much going on. But not only that, it has to have much shorter stems because there's not a lot of room for tying it in now. So I'm going to use mainly box of a little bit of ivy. Maybe a few of these rose hips. But basically a much smaller bunch now because the space that you've got to fit this bunch in is declining. Okay, so basically what I want to do is cover those workings there. So that's the gap that we want to fill. So we just want to take our much smaller bunch. I'll just pop the rose hips on in a minute. We'll just get it in a bit at a time. Okay, and then we just want to fit through our gap there. Okay, and then this is the bit where lots of people have a bit of a panic. Turn your wreath over because we do need to now tie our continuous length of string. So you're just going to tie it off to another bit of string. And I tend to just find several. Basically, I want to make sure it's pretty secure. Okay, so just tied a very basic knot, nothing special there. And I'm just going to do it as a double knot. And then we want to get rid of that tassel because obviously this is our hanging that we made earlier. In fact, we don't want people to hang it up from the wrong one. So that's our hanging. Right, so now we've got the basic framework of our wreath. Any areas where we can see the string, these are the areas that we now want to begin to cover up. And any areas that we don't think have got enough excitement going on, we can add a bit more. So, you know, I think I definitely need something more up here. Sometimes it helps to put the wreath on the floor to look at it. By adding a nice sharp point to the end of your additional pieces, you know, any seed heads you've got that you'd like to add at the end, you can now just insert them directly into the straw base that you created earlier. Finding a completely biodegradable ribbon, you'd think that would be really easy, but actually it's slightly more difficult. So in the past, I've used lots of quite big, fat, lovely burlap ribbons, and I really like these. You've got to be careful to make sure you buy the ones that do not have wire in them. But this year I'm using various cotton linen ribbons instead. Just a bit of a change, different year, different sort of vibe. And for this wreath, I've selected sort of a lovely winey colour with this sort of orangey brown, because obviously we've got those orange rose hips, and we've also got the colour of the orange willow. So I think that these two colours will work nicely together. Here it is. Thank you so much for joining me today for a spot of festive wreath making. I've been busy getting all of my materials ready to make several more of these over the course of the weekend. Do let me know if you have made your Christmas wreath yet, and if you have, what lovely little treasures have you found to put in yours? If you did like the video, please do give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to follow my ongoing cut flower growing journey, you can subscribe to my channel. And if you'd like to contribute at all towards the making of these videos, there's a link for coffee buying in the description to the video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.